Hey, it's Adriana here, and I want to just give my thoughts on two of the most recent Supreme Court decisions, which at first glance may not look like they're really related. The first was the bump stock decision, and the second was the Starbucks versus the National Labor Relations Board decision. And you may think, like, what do bump stocks have to do with Starbucks? But at their core, both of these decisions were attacks on the administrative state. And this is something that conservatives had on their agenda for decades. And through the Supreme Court, they're now enacting it. So I want to get right into that. But before I do that, I want to talk like, what is the administrative state? I am going to be playing clips from the podcast To Save a Country, specifically the episode where Sabeel Rahman is the guest. Sabeel Rahman used to be the head of the think tank Demos, which was a saving democracy based think tank and or promoting democracy based think tank, and he has a book out on saving democracy. So that's why he was a recent guest. So all right, let's get right into it. I'm going to play the clip where he explains kind of what the administrative state is. Okay.
When the president says something should happen on student debt or on the kinds of cars the government should purchase or whatever, that isn't the end of the process.
Yeah, that's just the start. So, you've got a big executive order or Congress says, EPA set the standard for regulating pollutants in the air. That's just the start. And then you've got all these folks in the agencies who are experts, who are economists, they're lawyers, they're scientists. They are the ones who then get into the hard work to figure out what those policies should look like, and hearing from folks in the public. All of that work then has to go through a final review by the Office of Information Regulatory Affairs. And so we would review these regulations, look at the legal basis, the policy analysis, but also sort of like, does this make sense? Does the left hand know what the right hand is doing? Are other agencies, do they have expertise that needs to be brought in?
Okay, so you heard him explaining what it is, and it is much more responsive to the public because the people in it are not elected. And you would think, well, how does that make it so that they're much more responsive to the public? It is a lot easier to get into a meeting by an agency than it is to see your congressman or your senator, unless you're a big money donor. Then you can get meetings with them all the time. But if you personally, as a voter, or your advocacy group, or even your like school, K through 12 field trip, wants to meet with somebody from the Bureau of Land Management, or wants to go to a meeting that the Bureau of Land Management is having about drilling in this or that place, you are going to find it a lot easier to meet with them than you will to try to meet with your senator or your congressman or the president, because they have to hold public meetings before they can go through with this or that policy, not backdoor meetings where lobbyists write the legislation. So he did a great job of explaining, what the administrative state is and what the agencies are about. So the Supreme Court said that the ATF did not have the authority to define what is a machine gun versus another kind of gun, because it is up to Congress to rewrite or write a piece of legislation redefining what a machine gun is. If you want to make a bump stock added to a certain kind of gun defined as a machine gun, then you have to write a law that does that. The ATF itself does not have the authority to interpret a law to make it so that a bump stock added to a certain kind of gun makes it a machine gun. Now, we each have 2 senators and one House of Representatives representative, right? Each voter. How many of you guys voted for any of those people because they were ballistics experts, specialists, or they had some decades of expertise in ballistics or guns, or they had a master's degree or PhD in something having to do with guns or ballistics, or gun policy? I do not expect the people I send to the Senate, the people I send to the House of Representatives, or even the person I send to the White House to be a ballistics expert. I don't expect them to be a climatologist. I just expect them to stuff the EPA with PhDs who people who have PhDs in climatology. I don't expect them to be an epidemiologist. I just expect them to stuff the Health and Human Services Agency with people who have medical degrees and have PhDs in epidemiology and disease theory and all that type of thing. So what I expect my two senators and my congressman or woman to do is to promote a policy objective, to point an agency in a direction and say, this is the outcome the people sent me to Senate or Congress to achieve. Now, you guys take your PhDs and master's degrees and get into the weeds and figure out how to obtain that objective. I expect the president that I vote for, the two senators or the one congressman, I expect them to have a policy agenda that is in line with my values, and then to point the agencies at the objectives that align with that agenda. I don't expect them to actually do the regulation, nor do I expect them to have, there are 350 million people in this country. We have 50 states, countless counties. It is a complex nation state we're running here. It is ridiculous to think that 100 senators and 400 something House of Representatives could possibly be the ones actually writing every rule, writing a law to cover every situation that comes up in all 50 states. That's ludicrous. You absolutely need an administrative state to administer the state. So to bind an agency, and say, no, you can't interpret, Congress has to write a specific law for that thing, is an attack. It's an attack on the administrative state. Okay, so what happened in the Starbucks versus the National Labor Relations Board was this. The National Labor Relations Board has a tort tool called an injunction that they use when an employee is trying to unionize, and in retaliation, the employer fires that employee. The National Labor Relations Board can go before a federal court and ask for an injunction to have that employee reinstated to his or her job. The logic being that because it takes years sometimes to adjudicate the cases where the National Labor Relations Board is saying this employer violated this standard and fired this person because they were trying to unionize. In the interim, here's the person that used to be employed sitting there with no paycheck. So it would for however long. So in order to avoid that irreparable harm, the National Labor Relations Board asked for an injunction to have the person get back their job while all this is being figured out in the court. So sometimes the National Labor Relations Board would go to a federal court over here and say, listen, there's a reasonable suspicion that this employee got fired because they were trying to unionize. So we want an injunction to have them get back their job. But then sometimes the National Labor Relations Board would go over to this court over here and say, there's absolutely irreparable harm to these employees that we're trying to unionize if they are fired and have to wait until we adjudicate all this. And look at the stack of evidence we have. It's very likely that we're going to win this case against the employer. So give them back their jobs now, or put this injunction forth that the employer has to rehire them. So Starbucks said, well, there shouldn't be two standards. There should be one standard nationwide, and it should be the irreparable harm standard. And the National Labor Relations Board is out of pocket coming at us with the reasonable suspicion standard. And the National Labor Relations Board said, we're the National Labor Relations Board. There is only one standard, and we get to interpret it, and this is all semantics, and the Supreme Court doesn't even need to get involved. And Supreme Court said, oh, yes, we do, and you're wrong. There should only be one standard. It should be the one that says there's irreparable harm and that you have to present, all this evidence that you are most likely going to win the case before you can ask the courts for an injunction. Now, Justice Jackson, in her opinion that she wrote separately, said, listen, guys, talking to the National Labor Relations Board, it shouldn't be that hard to prove irreparable harm. If you have the evidence to prove that they got fired because they were trying to unionize, this is a low bar, and it's not that big of a deal to ask you to cross it. But it is that big of a deal because you're still binding that agency. You're saying, no, agency, you have to go with exactly what the text of the law says. You don't have any room for interpretation. If Congress wants it to be a reasonable suspicion, they have to write a whole new law, whole new act saying reasonable suspicion. You can only go with what's here. That is a binding on that agency. And it's a lead up. It's a lead up to a case that's coming up that you need to be paying attention to, called the Chevron. Chevron doctrine says that courts in general, judges, have to defer to the expertise of administrative state agencies when the law as written is ambiguous. I'm going to guarantee you right now that the Supreme Court, packed with right-wing conservative Christian nationalist shills, is going to overturn the Chevron doctrine. And that is going to be their kick in the teeth to the administrative state. It's going to make it more difficult for the EPA to regulate the environment. It's going to make it more difficult for Health and Human Services to do its job when the next pandemic comes. It is going to bind the agencies in such a way that they are nearly useless. Now, that is exactly what conservatives want. Why? Because it is a lot easier to pour buckets of money on top of individual candidates or people that are already in the Senate or people that are already in Congress and legislatively capture them and get them to write laws that favor you than it is to try to get at thousands, I guess maybe tens of thousands of bureaucrats who are not elected and are only there to do their jobs for the public in the long term, to serve the agency that they're on. It's harder to get at those people. It's harder to manipulate them. So, and to give an example, let's look at the agencies about which conservatives are not complaining. When's the last time you heard the oil executives complain about the Bureau of Land Management? There is a revolving door between Bureau of Land Management regulators and the oil companies. That is why the oil companies get to drill for fossil fuels, which are choking the planet, for a pittance. They don't actually even pay that much to drill on public land because they have already captured the Bureau of Land Management people. And you're not going to hear them complaining about that aspect of the administrative state. When's the last time you heard Wall Street or any of the financial agencies complain about the SCE? Because the SCE doesn't actually investigate the financial services industries and Wall Street for crimes. They wait until shareholders sue for in a shareholder case, or until ProPublica or New York Times exposes something, then they go back and do their investigation and nobody ever goes to jail. All that happens is they get a fine. And when you and I read in the paper what the fine is, we think it's a pittance of the amount of money that they made doing that shady shit that they did. So you're really never going to hear Wall Street complaining about the SCE because they've got them in their pocket. I'm going to let Mr. Rahman again explain to you the agencies that they do want to dismantle.
Interesting to me about these new, the sort of Bannonite attack on the administrative state is I don't think it's just libertarianism of the familiar kind. I think this is really a white supremacist ideology wearing a different set of clothes. It's really about dismantling the parts of government that are trying to create a more inclusive, egalitarian society and leaving unchecked and unshackled the parts of government that terrorize communities of color, right? The Bannonites are not at all troubled by ICE and CBP and the way the Trump administration treated migrants at the border. They have very little to say about mass incarceration, right? Some good faith libertarians maybe might have something to say about that. But I think that duality is really worth bearing in mind, because when you hear rhetoric about government is too big and we need to dismantle it, okay, but if you interrogate which parts of government they're most upset about, it's not actually the parts of government that I would say are really posing a problem for communities. It's the parts of government that are trying to be most helpful and maybe are the most threatening to the 1% or most threatening to old hierarchies of race and gender.
I want to continue this.
So that's what it basically comes down to. Right-wing conservatives want to dismantle the administrative state because it's actually a halfway effective check on their unchecked power. They can buy congressmen and senators, right? And now I don't mean through bribes. They can just support candidates who are true believers, like they are. I mean, true believers in whatever ideology they have. But it's harder to do that with so many thousands of bureaucrats. And so they just want to sweep those people out of the way and have all kinds of unchecked power. And they're using the Supreme Court to do it. Please keep your eye on the Chevron doctrine. Please look into the description. I would highly recommend that To Save a Country podcast episode. And I've got a couple other videos in there that might interest you if you want to dive deeper into this topic. I hope you got something out of it. Please hit the like button if you did, and you could subscribe or not subscribe. I'm going to keep doing these videos. I just like expressing myself. All right, I'll talk to you later.